Hello everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Today I have several more stories for you guys to fall asleep to. Again, if the rain sounds in my videos help you sleep, please let me know in the comments below. With that, let's get into the video. A few years ago, when my daughter was a toddler, my wife and I used to take her to a nearby lake to picnic, swim, and just unwind. It was a peaceful spot, quiet, not too crowded, the kind of place where you could easily forget about the world for a while. One afternoon, after we'd finished eating, my wife decided to go for a quick swim while I stayed on the beach with our daughter. I watched her wade out into the water, the sun sparkling off the surface. A minute later, she suddenly stopped and turned to me shouting something. At first, I couldn't make out what she said, but her expression was off. Then, I heard her clearly. I think I just stepped on someone's face. I froze for a second, thinking maybe she was just joking. But the look on her face wasn't playful. It was pale, almost terrified. She quickly started making her way back to the shore, her legs moving faster, like she couldn't get out of the water fast enough. When she got back to me, she was visibly shaken. She said that while she was swimming, her foot brushed against something soft, and at first, she thought it was a rock, or a weird patch of seaweed. But when she pressed her foot down, she felt an unmistakable shape of a face beneath the water. A nose, an eye socket. She swore it felt hollow in the eyes. I considered going in to check it out, but something stopped me. The unease in my gut, maybe. We decided to pack up and leave right after that. The next day, the local news reported that a young boy who had been missing for days was found drowned in the same lake, not far from where we had been. He'd been there the whole time, just beneath the surface. To this day, my wife is convinced she stepped on his face. Okay, I never really post anything on Reddit, mostly just reading. So please excuse me if I do or say anything that isn't common courtesy here. In around 2018 or 2019, I was living in Nebraska, where I grew up. I lived in the largest city in Nebraska, but it was still essentially surrounded by corn and wheat fields. The city was expanding, so rich folks started building huge houses with giant properties on the edge of the town. All that being said, I had a good friend whose parents' house was on one of those big ones right on the blurring lines between the fields and the city. My friends and I were constantly hanging out at his place because it was fun. They had tons of property to ride 4x4s on, a hot tub, a huge living room for us to watch sports and have reality TV binge sessions, etc. Plus, his parents were super cool and we could drink out there as long as we stayed at the house. It was tons of fun even though I am, quite scared of the dark. So I would just not go outside after a certain time because there was little light and the nearest neighbor was about a mile away. I always felt weird energy driving to or from his place if it was late at night, but never had anything happen to us until one night. The drive out there was a long, winding two-way road that had thick trees on both sides, and you passed one of the city's largest cemeteries on the way. Barely any lighting, of course, beside the street lamps every once in a while, and very little traffic. It's all inherently a bit creepy, and I'll admit that I have sped through this section of the road many times to get through as quickly as possible. This specific night was perfect spring weather, so I was driving with my windows down listening to music. It was around 10 p.m. I was coming around one of the curves in the road when I had to essentially slam on my brakes. Right in front of me, in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards away, was what looked like a family. Again, picture a completely pitch black road with thick forest on both sides and only my headlights to show what is in front of me. This was a family of 3, maybe 4. A tall, slim woman, an average height and weight man, a child, short, but couldn't tell the gender based on the clothing and couldn't see their face, maybe around 8 years old, and the mother was pushing a stroller. Their clothes looked normal, not tattered, but not nice. They were also not carrying any kind of light source. meaning before I arrived behind them in my car, they had just been walking in the pitch black. They were all facing away from me, walking completely silent in the middle of the street, the same direction I was heading. I had turned my music down to hear if they were speaking or had any music playing. They didn't. The hairs on my arms stood up immediately. I came to a stop in the road behind them and just sat there for a moment to let them move. They seemed to be completely unaffected by me and didn't even turn their heads slightly, nor did they attempt to move out of my way. I literally thought I was going insane or that I was dreaming. It was so surreal. Before I really had time to fully process and register what I was seeing and how truly strange it was, they all, at the same time, stopped walking and very slowly turned to face my car. This scared the absolute crap out of me. I honestly didn't even give myself enough time to look at their faces as they turned. I immediately threw the car in reverse and sent it backwards for probably a full 20 seconds before flipping a U-turn, nearly running myself off the road and booking it in the other direction. The only thing I remember noticing is that the stroller looked to be completely empty. This was the part that sticks in my mind the most. I've never felt terror like that in my life. I checked my rear view mirror probably 1,000 times before getting to a main road and never saw a glimpse of them. In fact, I never saw a glimpse of them ever again. I tried asking my friend and his family about it, to only essentially feel like I was insane because of the way they looked at me. Every time I tell this story, I get one of three reactions. They immediately think I'm a cuckoo, think I'm lying, or have had something similar happen to them. I really don't care if no one believes me, honestly. It was, and still is, the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. I think about it all the time. It was either some weird family trying to scare the crap out of somebody, a distraction for an attempted robbery, assault, etc., or it was something more sinister. I'm going to tell myself for probably the rest of my life, it was the first option. I'm a behavioral health technician. I got a new job back in September at what's considered a luxury drug and alcohol rehab facility. The facility is a huge mansion that on the outside looks like a mix of Banks Bel Air Mansion on Fresh Prince or a mini White House. It's 3 levels, has 13 rooms that all have private bathrooms with jacuzzi tubs. There's a gym, 3 living rooms, a huge commercial kitchen, a ballroom/yoga studio, doctor's office, huge garden, and an elevator. My first week I had 2 clients tell me it's haunted, and I laughed it off. My schedule is from 11 p.m. to 7:30 a.m., so a majority of my time all the clients are asleep, and it's just me and the nurses in this huge house. My office is on the 2nd floor. The nurse's office, along with the kitchen and a huge pantry, are on the 1st floor. The pantry is locked at all times, and the nurse has the key. A couple of weeks ago, the nurse came stomping up the stairs, yelling at me, saying I scared her hiding in the pantry. I was lost because I hadn't left my office. And when I tell her that, she goes pale, and she says, "You weren't just in the pantry and yelled knock knock?" I say, "No, how could I be? You have the key." She walks out. 10 minutes later, I hear her talking, so I go down to her office, and she's down on her knees, praying in Punjabi. A 6 a.m. chef and a handyman clock in, asking how our night was. I jokingly say, "Casper scared Nurse J in the pantry." The chef says, "Oh, that's Kay, if it was in the pantry." He then goes on to say he's worked here for 15 years, and it used to be a retirement home, so lots of residents passed away here. He named off a certain resident and where their ghosts have been seen, saying they've always been kind, non-malicious type hauntings. Nurse J put in her 2 weeks' notice and is no longer here. I hear footsteps, lights flicker, and the fireplace randomly come on, but I haven't had anything actually speak to me like Nurse J. Though my pay is significantly higher than average, and my supervisor say it's because he can't keep knock shift staffed, I think it's because it's haunted, and my pay is too good to scare me away. I watched my coworker get arrested, and then found out he had a sinister plan for me. I worked with this man for a little over 3 years. We worked pretty closely on some projects over the last 2 years, and even sat near one another at work. In September, I showed up and saw about 10 detectives at my place of work. I was a bit startled, as this was quite unusual for my area. I looked around and saw my coworker was in handcuffs, and looked quite disheveled, which wasn't out of the ordinary, to be honest. I walked up to the detectives, introduced myself, and let them know who I was in relation to him. I asked what was going on, and they filled me in on why he's currently being arrested. For the sake of the case, I won't share more than that he's a disgusting person. Over the course of the next 3 hours, I watched as they dismantled his workstation, went through his belongings, took evidence pictures, and so on. I was pulled in and out of rooms answering questions about his character, what I knew of him, and my feelings about him as a person. I told them he gave me a weird feeling in my gut, that I've always told my husband I wouldn't be surprised if the cops ever did come looking for him. That my husband even thought he was weird, and if I ever went missing, that he'd be the first person to be suspected. I didn't realize how real this almost was. The detective on site told me that they served a search warrant at his home and were looking there for any evidence. It sounds like they found more than they anticipated, and we were looking to see if there was anything else unrelated to what they were currently investigating. I was asked my name and my husband's name for confirmation for something they found, which I did think was odd, but I let it go, and called my husband to update him on the happenings. However, the last hour I was pulled in for a final time and advised by one of the lead detectives, who couldn't even look at me, that I needed to ensure I was safe and protected in the event they didn't book him today. Come to find out, he had been journaling about me over the course of a year, saying he wanted to be with me, but the problem was I was married. His journal then lined out a plan to set my husband up for cheating on me, and the end resulted in my death, caused by him, my coworker. The officer said that everything in between was more vile than he has ever heard, to the point where he was crying when he was telling me to make sure I was safe. Crying. A detective. Thankfully, he was charged and looking at a long time in prison. But I still think about it. It keeps me up at night. It just shows you never really know someone, even your coworkers. So me and my best friend try to go camping once a year. We have been doing this since we were 13 years old. Never really been truly scared or had anything weird happen until last year in the Blue Ridge Mountain. We showed up during peak season the first night, and space was very limited. We were losing light, so we set up camp on a spot on the side of the mountain that was an absolute wind tunnel. Morning came, so we went into town, drank beers, and dicked around until late afternoon. By the time we got back up to the mountains to switch our camping spot, we were losing light again, but managed to find a more remote spot. We were setting up with our tents, getting the fire going, and started drinking again. Time goes by, it's probably about 1 a.m. when we see a flashlight aimed at us. And then it starts walking our way. We don't really think much of it, and assume it's likely a park ranger coming to fuss at us about something, because who else walks up on you in a remote part of the mountains at 1 a.m.? I don't know about you, but ever since I started camping, I learned it's kind of an unspoken rule that you don't walk up on someone camping that late at night, unless it's an emergency. Anyways, the person gets close enough, and we realize it's just some guy, probably early 50s, in a shirt and basketball shorts, and his girl, 40s, who's avoiding eye contact with us. The man immediately forces a conversation about nothing, doesn't acknowledge the time or his girl. His eyes were darting all over the place while he was talking about dumb shit like what model or style of lantern we had and how cool it was. He's saying weird stuff like how he used to be a former law enforcement, completely out of context to the random conversation he engaged us in. When all of a sudden, he pretends to land his flashlight on our tents and says, "Oh, that's where you guys are sleeping, huh? Cool setup." The way his eyes and flashlight are moving gives us both the feeling that he's trying to see how many of us were there, and what we had on us or near us, because his eyes and flashlight kept scanning the ground around us. We were getting sized up. For what? I don't know. Once this guy sees everything around us, he kind of pauses for a minute, ends the conversation, and walks off into the woods. Once his flashlight disappears, my friend and I look at each other, and without saying anything, he looks at me and says, "We're packing our shit, and we're getting out of here." So we did. This was the most unsettling thing I have ever had happen while camping. I think this guy was going to wait until we were asleep and come back. I just don't know for what. But I do know we were 100% getting sized up that night. Might not seem like much, but if you have ever had a moment with another human being who is sizing you up, you'll know what I'm talking about. A few years ago, fall, early winter of 2019, we were staying with my husband's father. We rented/moved into a house a couple months later, but had been staying there less than a week at this time when this happened. I was sleeping in the living room on an air mattress with our kids. The kitchen, dining room, and living room were all open space. There was a wide counter and a sink that was a bar on the living room side. He had never had stools or used it like that, though. Always had a sofa pushed right up against it, and he had storage for dishes and whatever in the kitchen side. On each end of the counter, there was about 4 or 5 feet of open space between it and the wall. Along the wall, directly opposite the front door, were 3 doors. Father-in-law's bedroom, bathroom, spare room, from left to right. My husband slept on the tiny spare bed. His dad kept the door of his room closed and usually had a TV on, and depending on the weather, either a space heater, a window AC unit, or at least one fan going. I don't remember if my husband had the door to the room he was sleeping in open or closed that night. Except for the back wall, where the bedrooms and bathrooms were, the house had windows all the way around it. Large floor-to-ceiling windows along the front and a line of large sliding windows along each side wall. It was originally built as a sort of getaway camp/cabin. Windows equal view. Apparently, he disagreed and was in the process of building a front porch and replacing about half of those windows with a wall. However, at the time, the porch was still being built, and none of the windows had been changed or taken out yet. This particular night, I was holding my 18-month-old with a child on each side of us. We had all been asleep for a while when I woke up. I'm not sure what time it was, but the house was mostly quiet, and no one else was awake. I lay there quietly, without moving around for a while, and couldn't figure out why I was awake at all, much less so alert. Not long after that, I decided it was just one of those things, sleep cycles, blah blah blah. And when I was about to try and go back to sleep, someone knocked on the door. Not a loud banging beating knock, but definitely a knock. The air mattress was in the middle of the living room area, and the door was on the kitchen side of the dividing counter. I really didn't want to answer the door for multiple reasons. I was in the middle of 3 sleeping children. It was late. It was cold and we were cozy and warm and all snuggled together. It wasn't my house/company, and no one else seemed to notice someone was knocking. The knocking went on for longer than I would have knocked on someone's door in the middle of the night, and did get more persistent, though never did it turn into banging. No one called out for somebody to answer the door. No one's cell rang. Finally, I heard someone walking down the unfinished porch. They had stacked some boards and tools and stuff against the front of the house. I heard no clatters or thumps or anything like that, but it did sound like whoever was out there was having a walk on and around those building materials. And then I heard a distinct and firm tapping on the window closest to the kids and me. There was a small, older TV and a small stereo speaker sitting on 2 small tables, about nightstand size actually. The one holding the TV was an old nightstand I had been given a few years before, between the mattress and the windows. I was facing away from the window, but the tapping was right where our heads were. An entire wall-to-floor ceiling windows, and the tapping was done only in the area that would have been in my direct line of sight if I hadn't been facing the other direction. I don't think I took a single breath until it stopped. I heard footsteps walking away, and it then walked all the way to the end of the porch where the driveway was. Walking across sheets of tin makes a pretty distinct sound. I know exactly what it sounds like when someone's walking on tin. What I did not realize until the next morning was that the only sheets of tin out there were already in place because they had finished putting it up as a roof over the porch before stopping for the evening, which meant that there were no sheets of tin stored against the wall / under the window with those boards and tools and whatever else was there. The only way for someone to have walked across those sheets of tin, which I am certain, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I heard happening after hearing an unknown someone knock and tap for so long it became unsettling rather than annoying, would have been for them to jump / swing up onto the top of the house / porch from an incomplete porch floor and then jump back down at the end. It scares me in a way nothing else ever has, and still does every single time I accidentally think about it. And that's why I'm typing this right now. I worked as a dispatcher for a pretty small ambulance station near a fairly large city in the middle of the US. I don't know how specific I can be since this is a true story, and I'm going to tell one of the craziest stories I have from this job. We had a patient who we'll call Susan. She was a dialysis patient, and one of the services we offered was to take very unwell or disabled patients to and from these dialysis appointments. She lived with her son, who we'll call David. He was in his late 40s, and his mother, Susan, was in her late 70s or so. Every week, like clockwork, we would have a unit bring Susan to and from her dialysis treatments 3 times a week. Everyone knew her at the station because we had been doing this for quite some time with Susan. We were all familiar with her and her son. Whether it was the crew seeing her in person and taking care of her, or speaking to her and her son on the phone frequently about the appointments as I had done. Everyone knew her. Naturally, when crews had news about her health, they would report back to keep everyone in the loop with how she was. At one point, she was not feeling well at all, but she wanted to go to her dialysis appointment. So naturally, we obliged and took her in. At this appointment, while receiving dialysis treatment, she lost consciousness and was promptly taken by our crew to the hospital. When it was time again for her dialysis appointment, we gave the hospital a call to see if she had been released. The hospital staff informed us that she would likely be released the following day and would be receiving that dialysis treatment in hospital. Then the next treatment time rolled around, and we called the hospital, and we were told that she had been released from their care the other day. This was great news, but a little strange due to the fact that we were always her first call to transport her to or from any hospital or appointments, and we hadn't transported her anywhere. We quickly moved on, however, and called David, her son, to see if she was going to be requiring us for her treatment that day. He informed us she wasn't feeling well, and that she wasn't up to it, but that he was considering taking her back to the hospital. We tell him that if he needs us, to just give us a call, and until further notice, we cancel her trip for the next day. We never got a call. Next appointment rolls around, and we call David again to see if she's going. He says she's sick, and she went back to the hospital. Weird again since we hadn't taken her, but doesn't seem that off considering her health had been deteriorating. The next appointment, same thing happens. We call David, his mom's in the hospital. We move on. Now this is where things took a bit of a turn. When the next appointment came up, we had tried calling David to ask about his mother, but he never answered or returned our calls. So, being that we had a contract with Susan, and we were to take her to these appointments unless told otherwise, we sent a crew to collect her for treatment. When the crew arrived to the scene, they knocked on the door to no response. They knocked again and were greeted by David smoking a cigarette. David seemed surprised. The crew said that they were there to pick up Susan for her appointment. David responded, stating that he had forgotten to call, but Susan was still in the hospital, not doing well. The crew gave their best wishes, and David shut the door. But the crew felt like something was off. They immediately radioed to dispatch that something was wrong, and they requested we call the hospital that David said she was at to see if she was still there. The hospital had no record of her being there since we last knew. So we had the crew leave the scene, and we called for a welfare check on Susan at her son's home. We heard nothing the rest of the day from the police, David, Susan, or anyone else involved. The next morning I came into work, and the very first call I took began with, "This is Sheriff blank with blank. I'm calling to report back on the welfare check you asked us to perform yesterday." I was really nervous as he sounded concerned, and I didn't really expect them to call us back with any news. He proceeded to let me know that upon arrival to the home they spoke with David, who was adamant his mother didn't feel well, but that she was home from the hospital. The police asked to just check on Susan to make sure she was all right, and eventually David obliged, letting the police in. Once entering the home, they were met with a grim scene. Though I imagine they smelled it first. They continued to explain that what the officers observed was the dead body of Susan propped up on the couch wrapped in blankets, as if watching the television. She had been dead for a while. They approximated around 2 weeks. When speaking to David, they found that he had been changing her clothes regularly and watching TV with her. He was obviously suffering from some sort of mental issue and grief, but the thing was, he had never taken good care of her until she was dead. No news coverage, no updates from the police. Nothing. Stuff like this happens in your hometown and you'll never know. Crazy, right? I once held a hunting lease in the middle of Georgia. It was an abandoned hunting camp that hadn't been used in several years. I'm not superstitious at all, but this place was legitimately spooky. It was miles down an overgrown dirt road and completely surrounded by woods. It was probably the most secluded place I've ever been. I used to hunt there myself a lot, and there was always this weird sense that I wasn't alone there. There was a locked gate at the front of the property, but it was not uncommon for us to find the front door of the cabin open, even when the door was locked. That was pretty creepy, but that's not what the story's about. One evening, I was hunting down in a small valley by a food plot. We put lining in a creek that bordered the property. From the minute I sat down, I had a weird feeling, even though I was holding a .308 with ballistic tipped rounds. I didn't feel like I was the top predator out there. I didn't see any deer while I was sitting in the stands, but the forest was abuzz with activity. Birds, squirrels, and other critters singing their normal evening symphonies. And then all of a sudden, silence. Everything just stopped. It felt like everything in the woods was looking at me. It was getting dark fast anyways, and I was extremely creeped out, so I packed up my gear and started the walk back to the cabin. About 100 yards away, I had this feeling that something was coming up behind me. I spun around and pointed my rifle back down the path towards the food plot, and that was when I saw it. There was something standing in the middle of the path. It wasn't a person, but it didn't look like a deer or anything I'd seen before. There was hardly any light to make out any features, but it almost looked like some sort of bipedal deer or something. It was just standing there, staring at me. I quickly made my way back to the cabin, packed up my stuff, and got out of there. I just let the lease run out. Never went back after that. My parents got married while still in high school. I wouldn't recommend this. The 12th grade to be exact. They were legal adults. I just came a year later when my mom was 19 and my dad was 20. We lived in a one-bedroom upstairs apartment in a crappy complex. I slept in my crib until I started climbing out of it and finding my way into my parents' bed, or into trouble. When I was 4, my parents decided I needed my own room, so they upgraded to a 2-bedroom downstairs apartment in the same complex. They fought horribly at the time, but outside of that, everything was pretty normal. I made a few friends with other children around the complex, and a cousin and her 3 kids also lived in the complex. Everything was fine until a new neighbor moved in next door when I was 6. Immediately, this lady didn't like me, and she didn't hide it. I was at school when she moved in, but on the weekends, when I went out to ride my big wheel bike and play, she stood in her door and glared at me with the most hateful look a person could give a child. To be honest, I didn't like her either. Something about her bothered my spirit greatly, though at the time I didn't understand why, and would literally spawn outdoors just to glare daggers at me and mutter things under her breath. I felt an evil presence on her and started making a cross with my fingers whenever I saw her. This enraged her, and she lied and told my mom that I threw a middle finger. My mom believed me instead. Strange things started happening in my room at night. I had a rocking horse. It was beautiful, and I enjoyed playing on it. However, it started rocking on its own whenever I tried to sleep. My parents heard this as the springs make a distinctive noise. I had one of those dolls that eyes open and close depending on if it's lying down or sitting up. The doll's eyes would sometimes remain open while laying down, or it would blink, scaring the crap out of me. There would be strange knocking noises in my wall. My parents heard this as well, and they permitted me to sleep with them in bed. One day, my mom and I got locked out of our apartment. This was before everyone had cell phones, and our cousins weren't home. My mom, against my pleas, knocked on the neighbor's door to use her phone. She let us in, glaring at me the entire time. I never let go of my mom's hand or came from behind her leg. In her house, on the wall, were multiple upside-down crosses, strange-looking masks, some with horns. There were candles everywhere and small, colorful bottles with powder in them. My mom looked around like, what the fuck, but kept her composure. She held my hand tighter, made the phone call to my dad at his job to hurry back now, and we quickly exited the apartment after thanking the woman. She watched me as we left. My mom told my dad everything, and he told his father, my grandfather, who was a pastor. He immediately brought us a bottle of prayed-over olive oil, holy oil, to anoint our house. My mom also told her side of the family, who were very strictly Christians, and they were, for a lack of a better word, flabbergasted, and started a prayer meeting. A few days later, we noticed at our back door a white powder substance across the threshold. My mom poured some oil on it, and it absorbed it and disappeared. The woman later tried to offer me some candy, which I declined, though I love my sweets. My nickname was Sugar Ant because I loved junk so much. I had made friends with a little girl in the complex that lived on the other side. One day, she had some soft chews and offered one to me. Like an idiot, I accepted and ate it. It didn't take long before I fell violently ill. Fever, sweating, skin darkened, dark circles under my eyes. Nothing given to me at the doctor's help. I couldn't keep anything down. On intuition, my mom asked, did I accept and eat anything from anyone, and I confessed to accepting candy from a friend. She asked around and found out the girl next door was the granddaughter of our next door neighbor. My dad called over my grandfather and my mom her family. They anointed me with holy oil and made a prayer circle around me and started speaking in tongues. I was in and out of consciousness. My grandfather lifted me up and made me drink some oil. I remember it burning my throat. Suddenly, I had to throw up. I leapt from the couch where I was laying and sprinted up to the bathroom where I started throwing up a thick black sludge. A lot came out. My mom was shaking and on the verge of tears. Everyone continued praying in tongues. I threw up for a while until it was all out. I suddenly felt a lot better. I was fussed at for accepting food from strangers, even friends. The adults talked while I rested. After a few days, the woman saw I was fine. This time I glared back at her as I was angry. I was young, but I understood that she had tried to poison me for no reason. I made the cross sign again with my fingers, and she went back in her house and slammed her door. She moved out sometime after that. I'm not going to hurt you. Remembering these words still sends a chill up my spine. This was a few years ago. My husband and I were getting gas late one night. This was a bit of a weird gas station, where two roads intersected at an angle, with the gas station being on an acute angle, if you can picture that. At the pump we chose, there were no working lights, and it was difficult to see directly from either road. We were driving a soft-top Jeep Wrangler with all our rear windows taken off. My husband got out to pump, and I was sitting in the passenger seat looking at my phone. That's when I heard it. "I'm not going to hurt you," a wavery voice said, some distance behind me. I froze, suddenly terrified. I turned back around to look at the empty space where our back window used to be, and saw what appeared to be a homeless man a little ways off. He had slightly wild gray hair, a washed-out beanie, and an oversized jacket with lots of pockets that hid his hands. I suddenly realized how dark it was, and how hard it was for anyone to see us. And I couldn't see his hands. I had a distinct feeling deep down, so prominent I could almost hear it. Run. But we're just pumping gas. He's just a weird homeless dude. My husband and I were from Key West. We had seen plenty of them before, and they were almost all harmless. So I slowly turned back around and went back to my phone. Yet, I still heard him. The distinct sound of shuffling feet, the rustle of his jacket. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said again. "I just need some help. Do you have any money? I'm not going to hurt you." At this point, I could tell he was almost at the Jeep. We had only been there a couple minutes, and we had been on almost empty. There was no way the tank was full. Without warning, my husband rushed into the car and hurried to start the engine. I could tell his hands were shaking. He managed to throw the car into drive, and we peeled out of there. I looked behind us and saw the man standing there, not reacting, next to the dangling nozzle my husband hadn't bothered to hang up. As we turned out of the gas station, my husband said, "I just had the most horrible feeling. Something in me just told me to run." I looked at him in horror, and I told him I felt the same thing. I felt tears come to my eyes as I thanked him for listening to his instincts. We went home feeling quite shaken, just going over the events we had seen and the fear we had felt. It was a day or two later we watched a YouTube video by a security analyst, Scott Stewart, on the Kenyon Mall shooting. He said that in every event like this, there are people who said, "Right before it happened, I had a terrible feeling that something bad was about to happen." He adds that some people listen to that feeling and leave the area, while others mention how much they regret not listening to it. I burst into tears hearing this, knowing the feeling he had described all too well. I had had that feeling, and was one of those who ignored it. I remember crying thank you at my husband for listening to his sense of danger. Now, it's fully possible that this was just a harmless person asking for money in a slightly creepy way, and that nothing bad would have happened. But I can't stop remembering how the weird angles kept anyone from seeing us. I can't stop thinking about how dark it was, and I can't stop thinking about his hidden hands. I still get full body chills remembering him say, "I'm not going to hurt you." The moral of the story, I guess, if you ever get that distinct feeling that something bad is imminent, leave the area. It may be a false alarm, and if it happens a lot, you may have hyperactive anxiety response, and might want to try Lexapro. But it's better than going the rest of your life wishing you had listened to that feeling. I was maybe 8, which would make my sister 12. My brother wasn't born yet, and I'm 9 years older than him, so it had to be before then. Our parents were out for their anniversary dinner, which meant that they'd probably be out till 12. My sister was very responsible and capable of babysitting me. I didn't find out until years later, but apparently my parents warned my sister that our grandma, my dad's mom, was a manic depressive, which is old-timey talk for bipolar. They told her she was mad at my dad for holding some boundary with her, and to not let her in or even respond to her if she came by the house. Of course, none of this was communicated to me. How could you tell an 8-year-old something like that? Anyway, a couple hours into the evening and we hear a knock on the door. My sister immediately shushes me and holds her finger over her lips. "Robbie? I know you're in there, Robbie. Come open the door." I remember it like it was yesterday. I could tell it was my grandma, but I could also tell something wasn't right. My sister moves us to the hallway, where we sit quietly out of sight of any windows. Grandma keeps pounding on the door, demanding my dad let her in. Then it goes for quite a while. I start to relax a bit. Of course, that doesn't last. Suddenly, a bedroom window starts getting slammed, and my grandma sounds like a fucking demon, screaming for my dad. I've never heard such anger since. She moves across the whole house, pounding on every window. If she wasn't so old, she would have surely broken a window with the absolute fury she was exuding. Then it goes quiet again. But now I know better than to relax. We are just huddled together in the hallway in complete silence. I'm shaking like a leaf, and so is my sister. This grandma had played games with my sister to hurt my parents in the past, such as taking her to the mall and going to the register with some jewelry, then saying never mind, or buying the same jewelry for our cousin. As I'm typing this, I'm thinking I need to talk to my therapist about it now. So it's been quite a while, and out of nowhere we hear Grandma putting on this sweet, sweet voice and trying to coax us with candy to open the door. She always had a ton of candy around since she was also a diabetic in serious denial. This was the most surreal experience, as she had just sounded like Satan himself, and now sounds like a sweet old granny again. She almost got me. Thankfully, my sister was wise beyond her years and held me tightly. Finally, it's quiet for about an hour, and my sister says it's time for bed. My bedroom faced the backyard, which had a pool and a high wall, beyond which was a vast empty field with an old railroad track through it. I was used to hearing coyotes, foxes, and other animals run outside. Right as I'm winding down to fall asleep, the absolute loudest scratching on my window starts, like it's Freddy Krueger himself trying to haunt my dreams. I could see the silhouette of my grandma in the moonlight. It was a full moon that night. I hadn't really thought about this in years, and my hair is standing at full attention on my neck typing this. No other windows get scratched that night, just mine. Then it was over. I woke up the next day, and my sister was telling her parents about it. I couldn't even be in the room while it was being discussed. A few weeks later, she died from an E. coli infection. She died like Elvis on the toilet. At her viewing, one of her classic flowy blouses, and there was a breeze that lifted it up a bit, causing one of my cousins to shout, "She's alive," and run away. After the funeral, I told my mom and dad that I was glad she was gone, and according to my mom, I said Grandma really stressed me out. She later told me no child of my age at the time should have to say their grandma stressed them out. Oh, Mom, she did more than stress me out. She terrified me more than any horror film or scary story or freaky night in the woods ever could. And I had plenty of those with my dad, who was an absolute wild mountain man. Both my parents are gone now, and I wish I would have told them about my experience that night, but I trust that my sister told them what they needed to know. I now have a 4-year-old daughter, and my wife's parents are completely opposite of my grandparents. Both sides of my family had seriously messed up histories. It makes me cry when I look at the picture of her with her grandmom and grandpop at their farm, riding a horse or chasing a chicken. I'm glad she gets to experience the classic grandparents experience. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be talking to my therapist about this one. I don't want anyone to think I believe mental illness equals more violence. My wife and I both work in mental health, and despite my personal experiences with Psycho Granny, I don't project that onto anyone else who suffers from mental illness. It manifests in so many ways. The vast majority of people are not violent. In fact, mentally ill people are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators.